They said it out loud, even if never on camera. They said it in memos, in side remarks, in the tone of every negotiation. They need us more than we need them. It sounded logical, comfortable, almost mathematical. One market larger than all the rest, one military budget that dwarfs the planet. One assumption repeated so often it stopped being questioned. Canada was treated not as a country with leverage, but as a warehouse with a flag. Close, friendly, predictable. A place where resources wait patiently until Washington decides how much they're worth. That logic worked for decades because it was never tested. Not seriously. Not when the costs were real. And that's usually how structural mistakes survive. Not because they're true, but because nobody dares to push hard enough to see what breaks, until someone does. This time there was no warning shot, no dramatic speech, no emergency summit. Just a signature placed quietly, confidently, as if the outcome was already known. A blanket decision applied evenly without nuance. Tariffs across the board, energy, metals, minerals, everything that crosses the longest undefended border in the world suddenly treated as a bargaining chip. The expectation was simple. Pressure creates compliance. Ottawa would complain, markets would wobble, then the calls would come. Polite, urgent. Concessions would follow, but instead of noise, there was silence. The wrong kind. The kind that appears when people stop negotiating and start recalculating. Because tariffs are loud, bans are quiet, and there's a difference between taxing a flow and turning the valve. This is where the main thing begins. Not with speeches, but with infrastructure. With rail schedules that don't update, with pipelines that don't reopen after maintenance, with cargo that doesn't clear customs because no one is in a hurry anymore. It looks like a technical pause until you put it all together. Energy prices didn't spike first, they twitched. Food markets didn't collapse, they froze. Power grids didn't fail, they issued warnings. And that hesitation, that lag between cause and visible effect, is exactly what makes this moment dangerous. Systems don't scream when they're being compromised, they whisper. For years, the United States was told a reassuring story. Energy independence, strategic autonomy, resilient supply chains. It sounded solid because it was repeated by people who never had to trace a molecule of fuel from origin to refinery, or a grain of fertilizer from mine to soil. The story worked as long as borders were theoretical, as long as allies behaved like extensions, as long as nobody treated geography as leverage. But geography doesn't disappear because it's inconvenient. It waits. And when politics reintroduce borders into systems that were designed without them, the stress doesn't appear evenly. It concentrates in specific regions, in specific industries, in places that don't usually make headlines until something stops working. The Midwest didn't suddenly panic. It hesitated. Utilities issued alerts that sounded procedural. Commodity exchanges paused trading, citing volatility. Refineries adjusted throughput, calling it optimization. Farmers delayed purchases, assuming the disruption would resolve itself in days, not weeks. All of it rational. All of it based on the belief that this was still negotiation, not separation. But there is a difference between leverage and dependence. Leverage can be traded. Dependence can only be exposed. And exposure is what happens when you realize too late that your system was never designed to operate alone. This is not a story about retaliation. It's not even about trade. It's about inputs, about the quiet substances that never appear in speeches but decide whether cars move, lights stay on, and food exists at scale. About materials so embedded in daily life that their absence feels impossible until it isn't. They told us this couldn't happen because it wouldn't make sense. Because allies don't do this. Because the cost would be too high. But that logic assumes symmetry. It assumes that pain is distributed evenly. It assumes that a consumer economy and a resource economy absorb shocks the same way. They don't, and they never have. What's unfolding now doesn't look like a crisis yet. That's the trap. It looks like a series of isolated disruptions. A pipeline adjustment here. A licensing review there. A temporary halt, pending clarification. Each decision defensible on its own. Together, they form something else entirely. This isn't escalation, it's reclassification. Resources are being treated not as commodities, but as strategic assets. And once that line is crossed, the conversation changes. Quietly, irreversibly. Because when a country stops asking how much something costs and starts asking who controls it, markets stop setting the rules. Geography does. And borders stop being lines on a map. They become pressure points. The assumption was that Canada would blink first, that access to the American market was the ultimate incentive. But incentives only work if there are no alternatives. And alternatives don't need to be perfect. They just need to exist. The question now isn't whether this will hurt. It already is. The question is where the stress will surface next, and how long the system can pretend these are isolated issues instead of symptoms of a deeper fracture. Because once you see the pattern, it's hard to unsee it. And at that point, the real consequences are no longer economic. They're structural. Once you follow the stress lines instead of the headlines, the picture sharpens. What looked like scattered disruptions begins to align into a single mechanism. This wasn't an emotional response. It wasn't symbolic retaliation. It was a systems move. Canada didn't raise prices to express displeasure. It reclassified flows to regain control. And that distinction matters because prices can be negotiated. Physical dependency cannot. Start with energy because that's where denial lasted the longest. The United States produces a staggering volume of oil, but production numbers were never the problem. Compatibility was. Refineries are not abstract assets. They are engineered organisms. They digest specific inputs. For decades, the North American system evolved around a quiet assumption. Heavy crude would always come from the north. When sanctions removed one supplier and depletion weakened another, that assumption hardened into reliance. The machinery adjusted. Billions were sunk into configurations that only make sense if that feedstock keeps flowing. When access to that flow becomes conditional, the system doesn't adapt. It degrades. Slowly at first. Margins compress. Output ratios skew. Then secondary effects appear. Diesel shortages that don't make sense on paper. Jet fuel constraints that ripple into logistics. Regional price gaps that refuse to close. This isn't speculation. It's mechanical. You can't swap chemistry with slogans. The deeper issue is that tariffs were applied to something that functions less like a traded good and more like blood circulation. The moment the border stopped being invisible, the architecture revealed its flaw. Pipelines don't reroute because a press release says they should. Rail doesn't scale overnight. Storage buys time, not solutions. And time is exactly what the system doesn't have when throughput drops below a critical threshold. Energy, however, is only the first layer. Electricity exposes the second. Nuclear power sits quietly in the background, treated as a solved problem until fuel cycles turn it into a countdown. Reactors don't panic, they schedule. And when scheduled refueling collides with paused exports, the problem doesn't announce itself loudly. It shows up as contingency planning, as deferred maintenance, as requests for exemptions that were assumed to be automatic. But exemptions are a privilege, not a right. When uranium is reframed as a security asset rather than a commodity, leverage changes hands instantly. There is no spot market fix, no emergency shipment that bypasses the process. Mining, milling, conversion, enrichment, fabrication. Each step takes time measured in years, not news cycles. And inventories are lean by design because efficiency was prioritized over resilience. This is where the calculus shifts from economics to strategy. Losing marginal oil supply hurts. Losing baseload electricity destabilizes. It affects data centers, manufacturing, defense infrastructure. It narrows operational flexibility at the exact moment flexibility is required. And the quiet part, the part rarely stated openly, is that military readiness depends on civilian grids functioning without interruption. Then comes agriculture, the sector most allergic to delay. Fertilizer doesn't wait. Planting windows don't negotiate. Potash looks insignificant until you realize that without it, yields collapse not gradually, but decisively. There is no substitute at scale. There is no domestic surge capacity waiting to be activated. The supply was assumed permanent because it always had been. That assumption was built into prices, into farm financing, into food inflation models that now look dangerously optimistic. When rail shipments pause weeks before planting season, the damage isn't hypothetical. It's locked in. Miss the window and the year is lost. Reduced yields cascade into livestock feed, then into protein prices, then into consumer inflation that no interest rate adjustment can quickly contain. This isn't a shock that markets absorb and forget. It lingers, it compounds. What makes this particularly destabilizing is asymmetry. Resource economies can endure contraction by redirecting flows outward. Consumer economies feel scarcity inward. One side tightens belts, the other faces absence. That difference defines pain tolerance, and pain tolerance determines who blinks first. The old assumption was that Canada had nowhere else to go. That geography trapped it. That proximity guaranteed alignment. That assumption expired quietly the moment alternative routes became viable and alternative buyers proved willing. Diversification doesn't require perfection. It requires momentum. And momentum is exactly what Ottawa signaled it was willing to accept short-term costs to achieve. This is the part that unsettles planners the most. Not the immediate disruptions, but the precedent. Once a supplier demonstrates it can withstand pressure long enough to restructure its dependencies, the leverage balance doesn't reset. It flips. Future negotiations happen under a different shadow. Trust erodes. Integration becomes risk. Defense planners understand this instinctively. Modern militaries don't fight alone. They are supply chain expressions with uniforms. Metals, energy, components, data infrastructure, all of it depends on uninterrupted access to materials that are no longer taken for granted. When those materials originate across a border that is no longer politically neutral, contingency planning becomes theoretical very quickly. This isn't about hostility, it's about autonomy. Canada doesn't need to threaten, it only needs to prioritize itself. And that's the quiet power of resource control. You don't have to weaponize it explicitly. You simply stop guaranteeing availability under all conditions. The most revealing signal isn't what was cut, but how it was framed. Reviews, pauses, strategic assessments. Language designed to sound procedural while buying time to reshape leverage. This is not escalation rhetoric, it's governance language. And governance language tends to persist. The United States now faces a choice it avoided for decades. Rebuild redundancy at enormous cost and time, or renegotiate integration under new terms. Neither option is quick. Neither restores the old assumption that borders are decorative. Geography has reasserted itself, not dramatically, but decisively. The dangerous part is believing this can be undone with a single concession or exemption. Some flows might resume, some pressure may ease, but the lesson has already been learned on both sides. Dependencies once exposed are never unseen. What looked like a trade dispute was something else entirely. It was a stress test, and the result wasn't collapse, but revelation. The system didn't fail outright. It showed where it would fail if pushed further. That knowledge changes behavior. Quietly, permanently.